This is a basic form editing session. So what we're going to try to cover in this session is how you build a new form, how you change it, make changes to it, add things to it, fields and other types of elements, and some of the other things that you can set on individual forms. Now, building and editing forms is all part of what we call process management. So to do that, there's a couple of ways to edit existing forms, and I'll show you one towards the end of this session. If you're building a new form or to edit existing ones, then you go to the Admin tab, and then you need to go to the Processes, Forms, and Profiles page. So to get there, I'm using a demo site that has the new interface, so I just searched in the search box for the word process. I could have also clicked on the left on side Process Management, and that would have given me just the links in that category. If you're using the legacy interface, then you'll have the same Processes, Forms, and Profiles link. It'll be in the Process Management section. Anytime you're doing process management, it's critical to have the correct module selected. The default is case matter. So the various tabs and lists below here are showing processes, forms, profiles related to the case matter module. So that's your pre-screens, intakes, and cases. You drop down the module list, you can see all the other modules that you can potentially do things with for dynamic forms processes. And so for example, if I select timekeeping, that will refresh the page, and then I can see on this demo site we have one dynamic timekeeping process for add case time and have a primary forms tab with the list on it and so forth. If you're going to create a new form, in addition to knowing which module you need to be in, so obviously if you're going to be creating trying to create a form for outreach, you would need to be in that module. For cases, that module and so forth. Then the next thing to know is what type of form you want. So there are, for all of the modules, there are 3 types of forms. Well, I should back up and say for all the modules, there's at least 2 types of forms. So there are create forms and there are auxiliary forms. So create forms are forms that will be used to create a record. So in the context of timekeeping, you're going to have a create form that's going to create a time slip. You probably, in the context of timekeeping, will never have an auxiliary form. An auxiliary form is a form that's going to let you do something to a record after it's been created. So again, in timekeeping, you probably would never use that. But in cases, common auxiliary forms, add a case note, close a case, those types of things. So those are the 2 basic types of forms you'll see in any module, whether it's timekeeping, outreach, case matter, and so forth. The other type that you'll see in most of the modules are branch logic forms. And so we won't be talking about branch logic today. We have a separate session that talks about branch logic and how to use those forms. Now I'm going to go back to the case matter module, because that's the module that's most frequently used by people, so we want to talk about that. And then if I look at the actions menu links for case matter, I can see in case matter that I have 2 different types of create forms. So there's not a link here for new timekeeping or new create form like there is in timekeeping. Case matter is special. It has 2 different types of create forms. So you have an intake form, and you also can have a pre-screen form. So both of those, if you use pre-screens on your site, that pre-screens can be like the first step of creating a case matter record. So those are create forms. Likewise, with intake, which everyone is going to have on their site, those are the forms that create a record in the database and that module. So that's your other create form in the case matter module. And in case matter, you also have branch logic forms, and you also have what are called case-specific forms, which are specific to the case matter module. So once you know the type of, the module that you need to be in, and you also know the type of form that you want to create, then you can make those selections and then click on the appropriate link. So for example, today we'll just create an auxiliary form. for a case. So something that we want to do after a case has been created and opened, then we want to be able to do something to it. So if I wanted to do that, I would go to, again, the Case Matter module, Actions menu, and then if I scroll down a little bit, I can see that my second to last option is New Auxiliary Form. Now, the elements that we're going to see on this page are the same, whether this was an auxiliary form, an intake form, branch logic form, and so forth, or most of the elements are very similar. So when you're creating a new form, the first section that you see is the name and description section. The first required element is the name of the form. And you may know from previous experience that the name of the form is whatever you want it to be. Obviously, you want to name it something sensible, so you'll be able to find it when you go to add the form to a process. And also, your end users will see the name of the form when they click the link to invoke the process that's going to call this form. They'll see that either on the left side or the right side, depending on the interface that you're using. So making it something helpful, even if it's something as simple, if it's like a 3-step auxiliary process, you'll see people saying this is the step 1 of the HUD process, step 2 of the HUD process, step 3 of the HUD process. So that can be helpful for your end users filling out the form. Just give them an idea of where they're going. Description is an entirely optional field. That will just appear in the list of forms. So that may be helpful to you to add a description there. Continue button text. This will let you change the text, text label on the button. So by default, on your auxiliary forms, or on most of your forms, the button is going to be labeled Continue. Now you may notice if you look on your site, a lot of your intake forms tend to be by default. They will have Save and Next will be the button label. So you can make this whatever you want it to be. So you can just have it say Save, Continue, Save and Continue, whatever you think is going to work for people in your organization. The next field down, skip this form when generating process as a PDF. It's going to default to no, as it has here. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this generate process as a PDF. There's a special permission that you have to enable for people to see that link. What this will do is enable a link as people are going through that process and allow them to print the forms in a PDF format. Active is a required field, has to be set to yes or no. So a form has to be active for it to be available to be added to a process. That if you have forms on your site that you're not using, making them inactive is a good way to keep your site cleaned up and keep your forms list a little bit tidier. So it's easier when you're working with your processes. Add a continue button is also a required field, and on some large percentage of your forms, you typically just want to have that be yes. The exception would be if you're putting a special button on your form, like a submit and configurable button, or block, I should say, which is going to do something other than just save the form and then go to the next step in the process, or in the context of an auxiliary form, return to the record, be it a case, time slip, or whatever it happens to be. Most of the time, you're going to have that as yes. Now, process types is a somewhat new option with forms. What this will let you do is it's going to default to the type of form that you started. So remember, on the main page, I went to the Actions menu and I said I want to create a new auxiliary form. So the process type is defaulted to auxiliary. But you do have the ability now to have a form be available for other types of processes. This is generally mostly useful in the context of the Case Matter module, where you want a form to be available for intake, but you also want it to be an auxiliary form. So it's available after a case is open, assuming you provide, add it to the appropriate processes and make it available. So if you do have a form that would be exactly the same at intake as it would be for auxiliary, then that can save you a little bit of time, so you don't have to create an auxiliary form and create an intake form. You could just multi-select here, and then this form would be available when you're creating an auxiliary process or when you're creating an intake process. The form elements is the next section. Of course, on a new form, it's blank. And we'll come back and we'll talk more specifically about how to add form elements, how to disable them, and what your options are there. And then the side action elements section is going to be empty. That is irrelevant to forms. And so one of the things you can do is you can click the little triangle out next to the left of the side action element and just hide that. So once you had your form ready, you would click on Continue. That would save your form, and then you could move on from there. So I don't want to create another empty form on our site. So I'm just going to flip over and grab an existing form. And you would do the same thing if you had just created your new form. It would be living on the Primary Forms tab, unless it was a branch logic or a case-specific form. So for our example here, I'm going to edit our auxiliary form training. So we can work with some more of these elements and see what they can do. The first thing to notice is over on the left-hand side in the new interface, it tells me if this form is part of any process right now, or is it like an orphan form that's not being used anywhere. So that can be really handy to know. So I can tell that this auxiliary form training is being used by the auxiliary process training in parentheses. The name and description section, you can see how we have this set up. So if we were using that PDF feature, it's not going to be skipped. Just left it at the default no. The form is active. We are adding a continue button. And this form is only going to be available for auxiliary process types. Again, I could multi-select here like on intake and or pre-screen, and I could use this form in any 3 of those processes. But I just want it as an auxiliary form. So I can just close up that name and description section and get that out of my way. And again, the side action elements a little bit farther down is not relevant to us. So I'm just going to close that and get it up out of the way. Now, the other thing that we see here on an existing form at the bottom is we have a checkbox for delete existing disabled elements on save. And then we have a changes section here that has a view log link on it. The view log link, if you click on that, that will open up a new window or a new tab, depending on your browser settings. And what this will show you is a history of who has edited this form and the date and time that they did it. Now you may notice over in the note subject column at the far right, in terms of the changes that were made, we currently can't show you, what somebody did to a form specifically. It's just going to say saved, possibly modified. So what that tells you is that somebody clicked on the continue, they edited this form, they clicked on the continue button. Now they may have not changed anything actually on the form. Now one of the things you will see is if someone deletes something from the form, from the disabled section, then you will be able to see that in this log. So that can be handy sometimes if you work in an organization where you have multiple site administrators. The delete existing disabled elements on save, what that will do is if we had some disabled elements on this form, so I'm just going to drag all but the header element down into the disabled element section. And so depending on how many elements you have disabled, this list might get pretty long. And if you just want to clean up this section, you can check this box and then click on Continue. And that will get rid of that entire disabled section down there. So now if I come back and edit my form, and I'll close up that name and description section to get it out of the way, and close up the side elements. So now you can see the disabled section is empty. And now if I click on the view log, it'll show me that I deleted 3 elements out of that were in that disabled section there. Now, the real meat of what happens is in the form element section. So the way you manipulate this is, in addition to being able to drag things back and forth between enabled and disabled, you have a drop-down list of the elements that you can add to a form. So you can see you can add headers, field sets, fields, and so on. So we'll add an example of each one of these so you can see what those look like. We've already added a header element to this form. And so I will next just add an instruction. So I select that. I click on the Add button out to the right. And that's going to refresh the page. And I can see there's my instruction element there. So let's go ahead and look at the configuration options for these 2 elements before we add any more. To look at the options, I click on the plus button. The options are going to be different for the element that you're working with. So a header has a text box, and so in this case, I've just typed in example auxiliary form, so that will just show up as a gray header bar on the form itself. If you're using the legacy interface, it'll show up as a blue header bar. You can see there's a contains HTML option, so you do have the ability to use HTML. So there's also a help hover box where you can type information in. And so I'll just type in some test information there. The help expanded box is currently only relevant to online intakes. Then you also have a special formatting dropdown. And so you can have this formatted as a header 1, a header 2, red text, green text, or bold. So H1 and H2, if you're familiar with HTML tags, you may recognize that's a header 1 and a header 2 tag. None of these other things are required, and in the typical scenario, you'll just fill in your text, what's going to display on the form, and then you'll be done with your header. If I expand the options for the instruction box, it has a text box where I can type in information, or I can copy and paste information to. This is just a standard text box. And so I can say this is an instruction for this form. And I can put as much information in here. And I'll just add a couple of things to it here. Also, if you're using any browser except Internet Explorer, you can grab the lower right corner of that box like you can on any other text box in LegalServer and expand it. And so if I want the instruction to appear like that, there's an option that I'll need to select here in a minute. So you have an option, should these instructions be a specific number of lines tall? So the box on the form, the yellow instruction box, will automatically grow and expand, depending on how much text you put in there. But if you want it to be a certain size, then you can use that option. By default, the option is checked for show these instructions in line. So that means to display the yellow box on the form. Alternatively, you can uncheck that and then check the box that says show these instructions when hovered over. What that will do is, instead of displaying the yellow box with your text on the form, you'll see a label out to the left with a question mark next to it. And the question mark icon, if somebody puts their mouse cursor over that, then that will open up a yellow pop-up box on top of the page, as opposed to seeing it on the page itself. Use large text for hover is also related to that option. So if you don't want to have the standard text size, you want to increase the text size, you can use that. The next option is show line breaks. And so in my example here, I would want to check that because I want my line breaks here to take effect. So I don't want this to all just kind of get swished together, into one line. And then finally, I have a checkbox for format as HTML. So I can put HTML tags in my text instruction box here. So I'll just do the very simple, is I'll put the strong on and strong off tags around that third item there. And then I can have a label text here. So by default, if I'm displaying this as a yellow box on the form, or end line as it says, I typically wouldn't use this, but I could in that example. If I wanted something to show out to the left, like it does for a field, displays a label. If I'm going to do hover, then almost certainly I want to type in something in the label text box there. Although you can leave it blank and it will just display the question mark icon. All right, well, let me go ahead and save this form. And then let's find the form on a case so we can take a look at what the front end is looking like so far. And then also I'll show you the easy way to edit an existing form if you're already looking at it. So again, this was a case matter module auxiliary form. So I need to find a case. And this form was part of the auxiliary example, I think was the name of the process. Auxiliary process training was the name of the process the form had been enabled on. So that's here in my actions menu. And so this is what our example form looks like so far. So there's that header, example auxiliary form. There's the question, and the question is not displaying anything, so the question actually may also just be effective for online intakes as well. So sorry about misleading you on that earlier. There's the instruction box. Again, we said one is displayed in line, so it's automatically on the page. There's the steps, and you can see that the third step is in bold text because I put the strong on and off tags around it. So let's go ahead and continue to add some other elements to this form. But let's use the easy way to work with an existing form. And to do that, I'm going to go to my admin menu. Now, you need a permission set for your role to see the admin menu and this edit form link. So your administrator role probably should already have that. But if you don't see the admin link or this edit form link, then go into your user role permissions. And for the administrator role, check the option. And I'm pretty sure the permission is called view edit form link or something like that. If you're using the legacy interface, this edit form link will be on the right side taskbar, and it'll be down at the bottom on a tab that says either admin or I think it might say administrative options. But what's nice about this link is that I don't have to go into the admin page, processes, forms, and profiles, and then find my form. And also, once I'm done editing here and click continue to save my edits, it'll take me directly back to this form. So I'll go ahead and click on edit form. And you can see we're back to the same place that we were by manually going over to the admin page and finding it. So let's look at some of these other options here, some of the other elements I can add. So I can add a Fieldset element. The Fieldset element is just a visual element that will draw a box around a group of fields. So I'll add one here so we can eventually see what that looks like. Your options for Fieldset is to start a new Fieldset and the prior one if necessary, so you can have multiples. So if you want multiple boxes on a form, you can certainly have that. The Fieldset can also have a heading. So I'm going to call this example Fieldset heading. And as with the header element that contains HTML, and the help hover and help expanded options don't apply. This is not an online intake form. So we'll next add a field element. Once you select field, then you get a drop-down list of all the fields that are available to put on your form. And this is a searchable list. It's really helpful in the case matter module because there are hundreds of fields that you could potentially add. So you can scroll through this list manually. The list is broken up into different sections or categories. The first one is uncategorized fields and site-specific fields, so fields that you or another administrator has added to your site. And we have quite a few on this site. Then we get into an additional contact section, then a advocate section, a callback case, and there's a client section, and so forth. But typically, you would just want to start typing. So if I'm interested in an intake field, I could type the word intake, and it's going to drastically shorten the list. And so I'll only get fields that have intake in the name. And I'm just going to grab intake type, because it has a couple of options that I think are helpful to demonstrate. Click on the Add button. Again, that'll refresh the page. And now if I click the plus sign to open up the options for this field, the options that you see here are going to depend on the field itself, the type of field it is, whether or not it is a special field within the database, and so forth. Now, for intake type, it is a drop-down list, and so by default, there's going to be no default, which means it would be a drop-down field, and it would say, please select, in the drop-down by default. Intake type is a special field that there's a user preference for, so you also have a user's preference option here. You'll see this on some fields. So whoever hits this field, or this form, I should say, if no one had ever filled out an intake type on this form, and the user had a preference set, then that would automatically default to that value. I could also set a default value, and if I drop down the options here, these will be the options that are in the intake type lookup on this site. So your site will have a different list. But if I wanted this to default to telephone, I could certainly select that. The toggler style is just what this will look like. So for most of your drop-down fields, drop-down menu is the default, or will be the default. That's typically the best option. Radio buttons can be useful on a form if you have a drop-down lookup field that only has 2, maybe 3 options or something like that. The empty text option defaults to please select. So that's just what somebody would see if there's nothing that has been selected for that field. But you could change that to anything that's going to make sense for your people filling out your form. You have a checkbox option for default overrides existing value. And this is going to be something that you want to use, if you ever use it, very carefully, because this will change data in the database. But if you check that value, and you have a default value selected here at the top, like telephone, what that would mean is that every time somebody hits that form, it's going to set that to telephone. Well, let's say that this form had been submitted earlier, and somebody had selected in person. Well, it's going to set it to telephone the second time somebody hits this form, and it's going to save it that way. So again, it's going to be changing data, so you want to use that pretty carefully. Next option you have for fields is right of last. So that's by default, fields and other elements are just going to display horizontally, or should say vertically, stacked vertically down the page. But for fields, you can have one display out to the right of a field before it by checking that box. The next box is required, and for most of your fields, that will be unchecked by default, and you can check it to make it a required field before the form can be saved. Intake type, you may notice, has a checkbox. The required box is checked, but it's grayed out, and I can't do anything. I can't check or uncheck that box. What that means, and you'll see that for a few fields in the database, not too many, is that this field is required, if it's used on a form, it's required at the database level. And so if you put intake type or one of these fields on a form, it's going to be required, and you can't change that. The other options here, bold, would just put the label in bold. Hidden would make the field hidden on the form. And so if you're going to hide the field, then typically you would have set a value for it up here, or user's preference or something like that. You can also have an option to make the field read-only. So if you want to display the field, but not give people the opportunity to change it. And this would typically be on a field that has already been set somewhere else in the case. So intake type might actually be a good example that was going to be set during intake, but maybe on this form for some reason it's going to be helpful to let people see that, but you don't want them to change it from what it was originally set to. So I'm just going to set that at no default and at read-only. So let's take a look at what that looks like on our form. So if I click Continue, then you can see on the form, the first thing is you can see the Fieldset element that I added after the instruction box, so you can see what that looks like versus like the header up there. And then we have intake type, and I can see it's assistance hotline because when this case was originally created, that's what somebody picked for intake type. But it's read-only. I can just see it, but I can't change anything on it. So I'll go back to my admin menu, click on Edit Form. We have two other elements that we want to add to the form, so we can see what those look like. The next element we want to add is a block. It works the same way as with fields. So you select block, and then you get a searchable list of the different blocks you can add. And again, this is going to be depend on which module you're on and possibly even what type of form you're on. I'm going to select address as a pretty common example. Click on the Add button. If you're not familiar with block elements, what they are is elements that typically display multiple fields. Sometimes it will just be one field, but typically they display multiple fields that are some way logically grouped, and then they would also have code associated with them that they will do things based on what the person selects when they're filling out the form. Block elements, some will have no configuration options, some will have a lot of configuration options. So if I open up the configuration on the address block, you can see I have quite a few different options here in terms of how we can make all of the elements that this block is going to display on the form, we can make them behave. So very simple ones like show the enter zip code instruction. Do we want to show the Google Map link? Do we want to show address and apartment? Do we want to ask if the person has been institutionalized, and so forth? So we have various options that we can go through and check or not check those. Some of the options, too, may depend on modules that have been enabled on your site. On this demo site, I have the last two options are use address validation and then show GIS boundary fields. If your site doesn't have the GIS module enabled, then you won't see those particular options in this block. So I'll click Continue to save our form and come back to the front end again. And you can see there's the address block, which is putting several different elements on the form here. That may not be really obvious about the field set, but what the field set element that we put up here is it is drawing a box around all of these other elements there. The final element that we want to add is a Listview element. Before I select the list view, I'll just point out that there are two other options here. That one is the tab block element that generally is never used on a form. So in terms of your forms, you can ignore that. It generally just doesn't make sense on a form. Tab blocks are heavily used on profile pages, especially the main profile that displays cases. There's also a break white space element, which just allows you to put some white space on the form if you want to use that. It's pretty self-explanatory. List view also operates like field and blocks. So once you select that, then you get a searchable list of all of the list views. Again, the module you're in is going to make a vast difference in terms of what you see. And I will just add the case contact list to our form. Most Listview elements now are dynamic to a certain extent. They are dynamic in the sense that they have a default set of columns that will display, but then you have the ability to go in and out of the available columns, enable and disable and reorder the columns from the default. You also typically, for most list views now, you have a show all results on page load. So if this list view was like most of them, which will show you, 1 through 20 of, if there are more than 20 records, you do have the option to check this box. And if this list view is going to show, had 25 records to show for this particular whatever form you're looking at, then the person working with the form would see all 25 of those by default. So the enable and disable columns, you just drag these around. So I'll first show you what this looks like by default without working with any of those, doing anything with those columns. Your list view won't come up blank. It will just have a default set. And so if I scroll down, you can see by default it's showing the role, the name, phone, address, edit, and remove. If I go back to edit the form, and you can see I have the columns here, but I could change that order. So for some reason I wanted, instead of the role to show up first, if I wanted the name to be first, the role to be after that, and then I wanted their address, and maybe I wanted their phone actually before the address, and I did not want to see the edit and remove columns at all on this particular form. Change that, click on continue. And then when we come back to our list, we can see the name is over on the left, then followed by role, phone, address, and so forth. The edit and remove columns are still there, but disabling them would have, if there were links that were potentially here, then I would not be able to see those links there. So that's our basic form editing session. And those are the elements that you can work with. Of course, in terms of your forms, I didn't specifically point it out, but hopefully you realize that when you're editing your form, you can have as many elements as you need on a form. So the form can be as long as you need it to be. Can have as few elements, just obviously depends on the form and what's going to make most sense in terms of people doing the data entry on the form. I also want to make sure that I haven't missed any questions or hands raised. I don't see any hands raised, and I don't think there are any questions posted. Nope, there are not. So I hope people found this helpful, and hope to see you in some future sessions. Goodbye, everyone.